Can I be heard and seen?
Yes. Yep.
Great. Hi everyone. Sorry for the delay. Technical difficulties.
Brendon.
Hello.
Hi, Brendon. Well, welcome to the class. Everyone, this is Brendon Fox. He is currently our director of our production of Hamlet at Chesapeake Shakespeare Company. I'll give Brendon a few minutes to introduce himself, but we're very happy to have him on board teaching this class today, and I'm sure he'll offer a lot of useful insights into the play. So Brendon, I'll give it back to you and you can start us off.
Great, thanks Gerard. And thank you for allowing me to share some time with you all. I have to admit, I'm kind of jealous. I've been hearing about the whole progression of the class and the way you've all been breaking down the play, and I'm thrilled to kind of jump on the train here. I should say that I'm going to try to cover a fair amount from different angles on the process so far from my perspective of directing Hamlet. But at any point, if any of you would like to jump in with a question or a comment, please feel free to either use the raise hand or jump in. So I'd love to make this as conversational as possible. So I know you probably know a little bit about me. Just a quick background. I am a freelance director. I've directed classical and contemporary. I'm also currently a professor at Washington College on the Eastern Shore, go Maryland. And I'm currently actually there teaching a Shakespeare class at the moment. I've directed Shakespeare at a variety of places around the country, including Colorado Shakespeare Festival. I also had the privilege last summer of directing at the Prague Shakespeare Festival, which was pretty life-changing. That was back in the time when we could actually, go places. This is my first time both directing Hamlet and my first time working with Chesapeake Shakespeare Company. And I'm loving it so far. And I've had experience seeing a number of productions at Chesapeake Shakes over the years. And I've actually brought students to see some shows, Restoration and Shakespeare. And that's had a big impact on my students. So I was thrilled when I and the artistic director reached out to me to join them for Hamlet. This is unique in that I have talked about shows I have worked on before, but I have never talked about a show I'm currently working on. As many things are new in this moment for all of us, this is one thing that is fascinating to me to share with you all some thoughts and experiences I've been having so far with the play. But I should start with the fact that we are still very much in process, even though we are on currently pause. So some of the images and some of the ideas that I'll be sharing with you are subject to change, which means you'll just have to come and see the show to find out how it all turns out. But I thought it would be fun for all of us, including me, to share sort of where we are and how we got here so far. I know that you've all been discussing the play and broken it down act by act. You heard from Vince last week, our wonderful Hamlet, and the text and also potential and interpretations. And I thought that I could share my part of the process from the point of view of a director coming at this piece, which has a fair amount of shall we say, baggage and previous interpretations to it. So I guess I'd like to start by sharing how I begin my process working on any play, not just Shakespeare, but I start with why. And in this case, this started last year when I first got asked to do the play. I started to think to myself over many months, why Hamlet right now? Why should I direct Hamlet? What do I bring to it in particular? And why at CSC and in Baltimore? I think it's important that plays and productions don't happen in a vacuum, and that it's important for the entire team of actors, designers, staff to have an idea of why we're doing it. Besides that, it's next on the season. and that hopefully people would love to come see Hamlet. But it's important for me to have buy-in both for myself and for my team, and to find the personal in the universal. And so as I started to think about that and my way into the play, especially with a play like Hamlet, which can be daunting, because it is a mountain of a play. There's a lot of ways to approach it, as I'm sure some of you have talked about in class. The text is ripe for multiple approaches. So for me, I wanted to approach something epic like Hamlet with two, I guess, tenets or personal beliefs. As any theater director or artist, I believe in humility and bravery. And in this case, I believe that it's important for me to be humble enough to know that I don't have all the answers for a play of this scale. I don't have all the answers, the way to potentially approach it. That's why I believe in the hive mind, and I believe in getting great collaborators together on stage and off stage and empower them to crosstalk and throw out ideas. And I'm a firm believer in the best idea wins. And I'm sure, as many of you know who go to see plays, if you're struck by a moment in a production, there's not a label attached to it that said, this person came up with that idea, or see this person to have, if you have a qualm with that. You either know if you're struck by something or not, or if you're moved by something or not. And so I don't believe in having ownership on that. And I believe in checking the ego and embracing the collective approach. Eventually it starts to hone down to, eventually the set designer does take on the specifics, but early in the process, which started last year, I really wanted to inspire, hopefully, the group, the early designers and production side, to think holistically about the play and to ask themselves those questions of why Hamlet and why now. So that's part of the humility, is knowing when to check the ego and not think that you have all the answers, but also brave enough to tackle it. Hamlet is a mountain of a play, and I'm thrilled to be at base camp 2 or 3 at the moment. We're not at the summit, but with a great team, we're forging ahead in the future on this play. But it does take some chutzpah to roll up your sleeves and say, yeah, we are going to take on one of the great classics in the canon. But instead of asking why us, I believe in why not us, if we bring something personal to it and believe in its relevance for the community. So specifically, as I started thinking about what were some of the big ideas in the play that jumped out to me that I thought we could explore in this production, one was the idea of corruption. There's a line in the play fairly early on, many of you recognize it, fairly well known: something is rotten in the state of Denmark. And when I was a kid and I would hear that, and I first started studying Shakespeare, I assumed that that was probably said by Hamlet, something he would say. But I love the fact that it's actually not Hamlet, but Marcellus, a guard, a character that we see early on and then pretty much disappears from the play. And that's one of the things that I think is so powerful about the play, is that many, many characters in this world have a lot of complicated thoughts and feelings about what's going on. They're not just plot devices. A character like him could easily be two-dimensional. But in this case, I think Shakespeare gives Marcellus a lot of foreboding and misgivings, and even the awareness that something is off or wrong about Elsinore since Claudius took over is felt across class lines and across professions. And I think that's really thrilling, that it kind of seeps out. So I thought that in terms of corruption, that the unethical and immoral choices made by a few people, in particular a couple of the older folks in the play, before the play begins, and then the effort to cover up those acts, is very relevant. And I think that the idea of people who want power and then want to stay in power, but that also can apply to even in everyday situations. People making a choice that they have maybe mixed feelings about, but then what's the effect on other people? But in this case, these are major immoral decisions, and everyone is affected by it. That corruption seeps out like blood in the water and goes everywhere. And it affects the entire cast, especially and in particular the younger characters. So if you think about Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who kind of get co-opted by it and get sucked into wanting to please Claudius and Gertrude. You have people who lose their sanity like Ophelia. We have Laertes, who begins to be corrupted by Claudius and then at the last moment resists and forgives Hamlet and asks forgiveness. And we have, we also have people like Hamlet who lose their life over this. Choices were made and acts were done that were not of their making, but they were affected by that. So I thought that was really powerful to me. That leads me to my next big idea that we're exploring, which is the idea that actions have consequences. This may not seem like a radical idea to explore, but I will say on the personal side, being an uncle to two young boys who are cute as a button, but also can get into a lot of scrapes, and also as a teacher and as a citizen of the world, I see that idea take hold with some people and not so much with others. Nothing is preordained, I believe, in this world. Hamlet and everyone else has a choice every second to what to do and what they think about what's happening. Does Hamlet decide to follow the ghost's command to take revenge? Does Claudius decide to repent or not? Does Gertrude decide to drink the poison, knowingly or unknowingly? So we're going for a production that emphasizes people making choices fast, on the fly. So many of these choices are not necessarily good choices or well-informed, but they are grabbing at straws and in the spur of the moment. That also allows us to have a production, hopefully, that is not ponderous or precious or important, but actually letting every character use what I call a short flashlight to kind of grope their way forward moment to moment. They haven't read to the back of the book. They don't even know what's going to happen 5 lines from now. And that allows it to have a sense of everyone kind of running downhill and trying to sort of do damage control, especially as the play goes on. So just taking a moment for a second on those ideas of actions and consequences and corruption, any thoughts or questions on any of that so far, and how you see how it may or may not relate to the text?
Hey, Brendon, I had a question that I wanted to ponder based off of your first statement. One of the first roles I played professionally was Marcellus, and the director at the time said he cut that line, "Something is rotten in the state of Denmark."
What? It's heresy.
And well, his reasoning for cutting it was that he thought it would get a laugh.
Oh.
I was just wondering, because you seem to have a direct opposite opinion from that director, and I'm wondering what sort of significance that line has for you, from like how an audience might perceive it.
Yeah, I love that question. I mean, this is part of the fun of directing, and also what makes it kind of a tightrope act, because this is also why we have previews, because I think that audiences, I think of directing and making a play like cooking a multi-course meal. I'm not cooking it for me, I'm cooking it for all of you. And part of the preview process and invited dress rehearsals are part of the tasting, right? Or what movies use focus groups for. And sometimes what you intend as a director or as a production may or may not land with an audience. So in a case like that, Gerard, that I think that I'm not opposed to potentially that landing with an audience in potentially a humorous way, which I think if it's ironic, which, I love when there's a variety of laughter, right? That an audience there's a laughter of derision, an audience sort of laughing because they're sort of not taking it all seriously. There's also the knowing laughter. And I think that there's a potential for, if an audience experiences that line with a sense of that chuckle of like, oh, you have no idea how right you are, right? That sense of we know more than a particular character. So I don't think that just because an audience may have a reaction like laughter to that doesn't mean necessarily that we're not doing our job or that they are somehow not taking the stakes of the situation seriously. But I think that in a moment like that, it might end up being a little funny just because it's so on the nose, right? And that we're not necessarily used to that, putting a finger on the pulse so directly. But I think what we're exploring in rehearsal is that if we are attacking the tone of that scene, like Horatio and Marcellus are just trying to figure out what the hell is happening, and try to and their worst fears are confirmed as they start to realize this ghost is real and what are we going to do about this. So it's a sense, it's a little more, hopefully a little more X-Files, which I know dates me, than something that's more X-Files and less Scooby-Doo, shall we say. There's a question here. When Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, was there rampant corruption in England that inspired the play? That's an excellent question, Margaret. And I don't know the full answer to that. From the research I've done, I think that what I found was that Shakespeare was often writing a number of his plays as kind of cautionary tales and to get in curry favor with either the Queen or subsequently the King. And I think there was definitely, he was playing into the sense of stories of other rulers. You notice that he doesn't set it in England, right? Those nasty Danes. He's able to sort of potentially make comments about his own system. Writers do this even today, but deflecting it by putting it in Denmark. From what I've read, it's not necessarily that Shakespeare is trying to make a comment directly about a particularly corrupt leader, but this idea of corruption being in leaders and those in power, especially those who take it unnaturally, right? You see this in many Shakespeare plays, and As You Like It, in The Tempest, you've got characters that take over a government, right? Create a coup, things like that, and that is something that is that I see as a thread. So I think Shakespeare, at least for our purposes, is saying this, taking a line from another great Shakespeare play, these violent delights have violent ends. When Claudius sees something that he wants, like the kingdom or Gertrude, then and does it, then we see what he reaps and the consequences of that. Nick, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, the question is, if you're doing Something is Rotten in Denmark, how does that affect how you picture Claudius as, the king? Does that, I don't know if this is premature and that's something you're going to get to, but does that view sort of stilt how you want Claudius to act and react and interface with the other people?
No, Nick, that's great. This was something I was going to pivot to, but I'll jump in now in terms of how I am looking at those in power, which include Hamlet Sr., Claudius, and Polonius. The way we're approaching this, and this went back to even in my auditions, because I had to think about what types of actors I wanted to cast for these roles. My approach in this production is that we're approaching Claudius with, I think, a lot of charm and a lot of savvy, political and personal, very charismatic, very attractive. But in our production, he's actually not the diabolical one. He's the one who was a man who thought it would be great to be king and wanted to marry this woman. And then he turned to somebody who could make that happen. And in our version, that's Polonius. That is different than some other productions. But for us, I'm thinking about if you've seen House of Cards or The Godfather, there's the consigliere, right? There's Robert Duvall, or there's, I'm forgetting his name, but Doug Stamper in House of Cards, the fixer. So we're approaching this a little bit like Polonius is actually the one who made that happen. I'm even thinking behind the scenes, we're talking to the actors about maybe Polonius actually procured the poison for Claudius to do it. was still Claudius's deed. He went ahead and did it, but that he is certainly rotten in the sense of being immoral, but he actually was like, I just want to be king. This would be fun. And that's actually, you'll see in a bit, I'm going to share some of the costume ideas. Christina, the costume designer, and I really embrace this idea of him showing off, like, look at all my medals, but he's not really a soldier. He just wants to play at being a soldier. And so therefore there's a larger issue of being, the state is corrupt, but it's actually goes deeper than Claudius. And he actually, so Brett, who we cast as Claudius, is incredibly charming and almost folksy. And it's very disarming, because what it does then is it puts, hopefully it puts the audience into a perspective of looking at Hamlet like, why are you being such a brat in the beginning? And it allows Hamlet to not be sure about the ghost, thinking, well, is the ghost right? Because I don't like him. He's my stepdad. Naturally, he's rubbing me the wrong way, but is he really a killer? So the actor playing Claudius and I, we're right, as I said, we're right in the middle of rehearsals, but we're playing with, when does the veil drop, right? When does he reveal, when things get really hot and heavy, the steel underneath the charm? But we're really letting that be a lot more in terms of Polonius having a lot of power and being somebody who, for example, we're keeping in the scene between Polonius and Reynaldo, where Polonius is early on sending Reynaldo to go spy on his own son. So I thought, well, that to me sounds like somebody who would run the CIA, somebody who isn't afraid of actually spending state money and staff to go spy, and then he does the same thing with his daughter. So those clues were leading me to think, maybe we'll rethink. Polonius is not a goof in this. He's not a clown in our production. He's just the opposite. Claudius is somewhere between. Richard, you have a hand raised?
Just a comment that James Shapiro makes the point that Shakespeare probably wrote the play in the wake of the Essex uprising, and that may have influenced it.
Yes, thank you. I forgot to mention that. Thank you for that. Absolutely. David?
Yeah, I have a question, just following up on what you were saying about actions having consequences, yeah, and also the short flashlight. I want to know, what do you think Hamlet thinks is going to happen next after he kills Claudius, or after he exposes what Claudius has done? What is he thinking? He doesn't know everyone's going to die. So what does he think is going to happen next? Is that what's on his mind when he's saying to be or not to be? Is he saying, if I do this, it could be the undoing of me. It could be the end of me. Do I really want to take that risk?
David, I think that's fantastic. I'm going to table your point about to be or not to be to discuss that in a little bit, because we're doing something extra special with that moment. But in general, I think you hit upon something that we've actually recently talked about in rehearsal before we had to stop rehearsing, which is Vince and I talked a lot about him not knowing that he really hasn't thought that much far ahead. He doesn't even know how he would even out Claudius. And then he has this moment when he makes a connection with the players. And that allows him to have that little spark of insight to think, you know what, I've heard about people actually literally, and this is based on stories of the time that our dramaturg, Kate Moncrief, found, of people literally standing up in the middle of a play and saying, I murdered my husband. So this was out there. And so Shakespeare takes that and puts that into Hamlet's head saying, I've heard about this. That actor is really good. Maybe that'll get him to out himself. But beyond that, I don't think he knows. And that was a real breakthrough for me and Vince, is to let him really kind of move backwards through the play, because he is still trying to wrestle with, is this ghost even the devil or an angel? Because maybe if he's the devil, he might be trying to, commit me to damnation, and maybe I've got the wrong guy. So once we did that, it actually allowed Vince to just live more moment to moment and live in the not knowing. And I think that's something sometimes we forget, where he's played like, oh, I've got the long game. And we love the idea that he really has so many early questions on, who is this ghost? What is it? Where does this come from? Should I trust it? And even if I do trust it, how the hell am I going to get him to trip himself up? So I think that's exactly Our answer is he doesn't know. And then once Claudius does explode, which is going to be where we're going to take our intermission, then he's left with, well, now what? And that's what sort of comprises his, next part of his journey. Emily Hansen?
So you made a really interesting comment about how you've kind of turned Polonius into the power behind the throne and the one who kind of pushed Claudius forward. How much did it go into your thinking, the fact that many people view Polonius as kind of an avatar for William Cecil, who was the power in many ways behind Elizabeth's throne?
That was part of it, actually. I did, working with my dramaturg, I did, when I uncovered that in the research, I was already starting to think that way about Polonius. And then, as a director, those happy accidents, right? When it lines up and you think, oh, that's great. That's even more grist for the mill. So again, this is something that helps me, my actor, my dramaturg. Whether that ends, some people in the audience might make that connection, some may not, but I loved that synced up. And that was, and it's really playing out in Ron Hennigan is doing a beautiful job as Polonius, and that we are treating him as very savvy, and he's definitely got a healthy ego, but he's not to be mocked. The other thing I shared with Ron before we start rehearsals was Polonius is a man who has been chief of staff for 2 kings. If he's ridiculous, isn't there anyone else in Denmark who can have the job? It really makes me think Denmark has a job pool of 5 or something. And you think, like, this guy that seems to be a bloviating idiot in some productions makes me look at then Hamlet Senior and think, why'd you hire the guy, right? So, and I really do think sometimes audiences think this. So I thought that I started with taking him seriously, then I went to the place of, actually, he's not just someone to be taken seriously. He's actually the power behind the throne, like you said. Martin?
Yeah. So as I mean, it's hard to accept or believe of Polonius as like a complete idiot sometimes. But the effect it usually has is that when Hamlet kills Polonius, it's when it sets in, at least for me when I watch adaptations of it, just how badly Hamlet is screwed up. I mean, he hasn't done what he set out to do, and he kills someone that, as far as we know, is like innocent, or at least didn't deserve to die. And then especially when he sees the ghost and Gertrude doesn't, it's probably, I don't know. It's certainly, for me, when I see it, I'm thinking like, oh, this is when I have my most doubts as to whether Hamlet's like the good guy in this situation. But so in this take on Polonius, does Hamlet know how much of a power behind the throne Polonius is, or does the scene play the same? Like, as far as he knows, Polonius was just a idiot.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, Arn. That's something we're working on. That's a to be continued question. That's exactly on the docket for our rehearsals. At the moment, we want to find moments where there's a moment that I'm gonna actually have Hamlet eavesdrop on Polonius and Claudius right before the scene where Polonius gets killed. That he and Claudius are sort of convening after the play within the play, and Polonius says, I'm going to go to his mother, and Claudius says, we're going to send him to England, because I'm going to have Hamlet overhear that and stand in the aisle potentially near the audience to clock that. Whether he knows much more than that about Polonius is still something that's TBA. My sense at the moment is we're probably not going to necessarily have Hamlet be privy to all of it, so that he can still have some guilt and some ambiguity about what he did. But I think, Arn, I'm very okay with people not having very mixed feelings about Hamlet over and over in the play. How he treats his mother, how he treats his friends. I mean, how he treats Ophelia. There's and there's something how I work with my actors. I don't tend to care about likability. I save that for Facebook and Instagram. because I think thumbs up are great and hearts. But do you understand where Hamlet's coming from? Are you compelled by his dilemma? And like exactly what you're talking about sort of tracking his complicated journey is great. And I think actors like being freed up from having to be likable. And to me, that's also, you know, those are the kind of shows on HBO I want to watch too. So letting that be complicated. And I think in this sense with Polonius, did he deserve to die? Right now Hamlet has blood in his hands. It's in the previous scene, he could have killed Claudius while he's praying. He decides not to. 2 seconds later, he thinks it's Claudius. He acts rashly. And it goes back to actions have consequences. The upside, if there is one, is that strangely, that killing allows him and Gertrude to have more vulnerability with each other. They actually, and she ends up joining sort of Team Hamlet after that. So it's all really complicated and juicy, which I love. Before I go on, Nick, did you have a question or comment?
It's Cynthia this time. I told
Hi,
Nick
Cynthia.
to get a refill on my wine. I want to know about your Gertrude. I've never really thought about Gertrude before this class, but you know, I'm saying, why did she potentially give up the throne to Claudius? We mentioned a couple weeks ago that she and Claudius may have been lovers beforehand. We also talked that she may have been part of, was Ophelia really a suicide? Why did she stand by? And then you just mentioned that why did she drink the poison? Like, did she know it was poison? So who was your Gertrude?
Well, I mean, do you know who literally is my Gertrude?
No.
It's Leslie Mallon of the Chesapeake Shakespeare Company.
There you go. And then there's that. So
Yeah. No, I mean, first of all, I'm so lucky to be working with so many of these great actors of the company. It's a great mix of people who are part of the what we call the usual suspects, and in ways you may or not have seen them before. But also, we got some really cool, interesting new folks coming in as well. But I think so far, Leslie and I have talked about all of that and the possibility of a previous relationship with her and Claudius. I think that. We talked a lot about in terms of the triangle of what did she get personally and politically out of being aligned with Hamlet Sr. and how we talked a lot about if Hamlet Sr. is known as a warrior, right? He appears in his warrior aspect. Something I talked about with Vince was maybe imagine this is a warrior, right? Who is formidable, and then what does his son go off and do? Not be a warrior. He goes to grad school. And just kicks around being a scholar. Maybe not the ideal thing for dad, right? Who was maybe hoping to groom him to be another Fortinbras, and instead he's like, I'm gonna take a long, long time in grad school to just think about things and study with Dr. Faustus or something like that, right? It's like a Marine father's worst nightmare. And right? And yet Brett, who's playing Claudius, posed the idea of like maybe Claudius in some ways actually was a little closer to Hamlet earlier on when he didn't have to be the stepfather, but was a looser person, a little more accessible, not sort of expecting Hamlet to step up and do X or Y, which also makes it really juicy and complicated. But I think in terms of Gertrude, it was a powerful match, she was a warrior queen, sort of a Lady Macbeth in a way, in a potentially a good way, like, Duncan's wife, right, in Macbeth. But if there was a previous relationship and such, if there was what she found in Claudius so far, what we're sharing is that he's very empathetic. He's a very good listener. He's very charming and very connected to her. Physically, we're really in the production, like emphasizing their tactilness together, their sensual connection. It allows her to have another part of her come out. And that's something also that we're exploring with costumes, is that she's going to be resplendent in red in the beginning, so that she is and Claudius are going to be sort of this power couple, right? that get to sort of flaunt, be a peacock for the first time in her life. He says, if you look at Claudius's first speech, he says, imperial jointress to our warlike. So he says, we're a partnership here. So one thing that Leslie brought up, and we talked about in our early table work ideas before we got on our feet, was what if she marries him, he comes into her power. So instead of giving it to him, or just giving it away, she's like, she could have stayed a widow, which could have been very powerful. And widows hold a really unique place in Shakespeare. There's sort of this other that men are often intimidated by, and yet she actually brings him into the fold. So there's a sense of, she was one Gertrude to Hamlet Sr., now she's another Gertrude to Claudius. And then the other thing we're exploring is, who is she after she starts to detach from Claudius and after Polonius' killing, and she and Hamlet rebond and maybe haven't talked like this in years. And now she starts to lie to Claudius about Hamlet's sanity. She starts to estrange herself more when he starts to spend more time with Laertes. There, in the graveside scene, remember Claudius says, look after your son there, Gertrude, right? If that doesn't sound like marriage counseling in need, I don't know what, right? So they're going like this, and we're reflecting that hopefully with the costumes, that there's a third Gertrude, maybe Gertrude who's living for Gertrude.
Okay.
Right? And then we see her. So when you say that moment, the poison, that's a very exciting moment that we are going to be exploring in terms of agency and actions and consequences. Does she know what she's drinking? If she does know, why does she do it? And if she knows he knows, does she want him to come clean, right? Like, I don't have to drink this if you reveal what you're doing, right? So I'm always in favor of every character, even to their last dying breath, still having agency. So that's where we are so far with her, to make her as complicated as possible.
Fun. Thank you.
Edith, thank you. Edith, you have your hand up? Are you there, Edith? I think I unmuted you. Can you hear me now? Okay, we will, maybe we can come back to her. I would just love to for a second pivot back to the last couple of quick ideas that I wanted to share also with our production. The other two other big ideas we're playing with and exploring is gender. For the last number of years, as I've been doing more and more classic work, I've been struck by the discrepancy in traditional casting. I think it's something like maybe 16 or 17% of all of Shakespeare's roles are women, written as women. And more and more I've been focused on EDI, or equity, diversity, and inclusion in my directing. And so what does that mean? And it's different for every production and with every theater company I work with. But it's something I know that it's important to Chesapeake Shakespeare, and it's important to me. So as we went into auditions, I was very clear to those coming to audition that I was open to most, if not all, the roles being considered as a different gender than potentially written on the page. So that enabled us to see some really remarkable actors across the board in the Baltimore community coming out for different roles. And it allowed me to learn a lot more about these roles than I had initially thought. And as a result, we've have a very diverse cast. And one thing that's really exciting is a number of roles that many of you might have seen previously played by men are being played by women, such as Horatio, Laertes, Fortinbras, all of the and others are played by Guildenstern are played by women as women. There are also going to be some roles that some women are going to be playing more as men or as potentially gender fluid. So for example, what we're already exploring in really fascinating ways is Polonius has two daughters, not a son and a daughter. So when Polonius talks to Laertes about going off to France, that becomes a very different tone And also when Laertes talks to Ophelia early in the play about be careful of Hamlet, that's now two sisters talking, not a brother to a sister. So exploring gender roles and gender expectations has been very exciting in that way. And one of the things that the actress playing Laertes brought up was, it makes a lot of sense. We decided, and we'll talk more about this in a second, but we decided to set our production in Scandinavia, late 19th century, for reasons I'll get into in a bit. But the actress playing Laertes, Fabiola, shared early in rehearsal that she's been thinking about it and realized that it would make a lot of sense in a culture like that. It's like Scandinavia at that moment. She felt like, of course I want to go to Paris, where I might feel more accepted, where I might want to feel more free. I might be able to just explore more and not have as much expectations put on me. Because we also talked about, why does Laertes want to go back to Paris so badly and get out of the court? That was something that that elicited that. Horatio being a woman, our backstory is that we're exploring her being a schoolmate of Hamlet's at Wittenberg, which is going to affect their relationship, not necessarily romantically, but it's all of those are adding different colors to it. And the last big idea I wanted to mention that we're exploring is surveillance. There's a lot of eavesdropping, a lot of people being, from, like I mentioned, Reynaldo's going off stage to spy on Laertes, to people like Ophelia on stage being put up to trap Hamlet while being overheard by Claudius and Polonius. In the play within the play, we've got Hamlet and Horatio watching Gertrude and Claudius for their reaction while they're watching the play. So all those layers of watching. There's going to be people lurking in the aisles, watching what's happening on stage. We have people in windows. I'll share with you in a moment some of the images of our set and the inspiration behind it. And one of the things Jim Kronzer, our set designer, was excited by that idea of surveillance was to create massive windows and use the height of Chesapeake Shakespeare's space to allow different levels of people eavesdropping and looking through windows or seeing shadows and such. We're really going to use the verticality of the space to lean into that sense of who knows what, who's spying on who, and such. So, and so lastly, what I wanted to mention was setting in Scandinavia in the 19th century, we decided to set it there for a couple of reasons. One, we wanted to find a time and a place that evoked honor, duels would still be something semi-normal, somewhere between ceremonial and actually taking an action. The battle between the rational and the irrational was still going on. This was still a time where even Arthur Conan Doyle, the great writer of Sherlock Holmes, was participating in seances. And such, so people holding both of those ideas in their head, an era of nobility, but on the cusp of the new, so that Hamlet and the younger generation are sort of trying to push forward into the 20th century, and we did find some evidence of women, some women getting enrolled in higher education and such, so we could find some examples of a Horatio in those environments. And we also loved the idea of the cold. We loved that embracing that sense of the coldness both inside and out, the trepidation, the walking on eggshells and ice that people have to do the more the play goes on. And I was just struck by this image of snow falling maybe in the beginning and the end. And then when the ghost first appears, the guards are outside among snowdrifts, and the final battle, the final duel will be in the snow. How we evoke that, you'll have to come and see, but that's that sense of that snow can be both beautiful, but also can kill you. And the designers really ran with that, and we're looking at that with lighting and with set. And also I'm a big fan of Dr. Zhivago, I have to admit. So there is something kind of beautiful about the idea of maybe seeing Ophelia or Gertrude at some point with that beautiful muff and the fur. So it's another way to show elegance. So before I go further, I'd love to open up for questions, comments on any of those ideas. I see, yeah, Jody or Josie has a comment about by making Horatio a woman, even though that promotes women's visibility and representation, takes away the queer subtext of some of those Hamlet Horatio scenes, which in my opinion is equally important. I absolutely, totally understand that. It was something that we did not take lightly, and we had thought that through. I think that it is something that when we decided to go down this road, we were excited that we could explore this relationship, again, not necessarily in a romantic way, but what does it do in terms of Horatio and her role in this, and what does she, why is she even there? And how also we decided in our cutting that Horatio is the one who actually is keeping Ophelia in mind. When Ophelia starts to unravel, instead of having a nurse or an attendant, I've changed that to Horatio. So that Horatio, while Hamlet's off fighting, being with pirates, Horatio is actually with Ophelia, which I think is going to be really interesting. Other questions, comments? Edith, I still see a hand up. I didn't know if you had anything. Anything else on this so far? The other thing that leads us to, in terms of costumes and such too, is that the soldiers are going to be really bundled up. They've got long rifles, but there's a line even in the text, "The air bites shrewdly," and we were leaning into that. We're also really excited to explore the players when they show up. We're exploring them being sort of people who live up in the northern part of the country, kind of closer towards the Arctic Circle, who are going to come down with animal hides and such. They're from a very different world than the elegance of Elsinore, and who are coming in with a very bare bones type of theater. So they're not, every production makes different choices regarding this group of players, and we've decided to lean into this idea of them being a very poor theater, and I think they're powerful actors, and I think Hamlet really relishes the idea of bringing in this group that's going to create this kind of tension between the opulence of Elsinore and these people who have almost nothing, but their art. And that's an area that actually Hamlet feels very connected to. One thing we've talked a lot about is Hamlet feels very comfortable, I think, with the player king. I even talked to Vince about, to me, he seems almost the most comfortable he is with anyone in the play. He feels very relaxed. He feels very open. He can joke with them. He says that these people need to be taken care of and have to be given good bedding, and he believes in their power. Like we talked about earlier, of all the ways he could possibly out Claudius, he decides that theater could do it. Of course, I'm a little biased, but I think that's kind of beautiful that he believes in the power of that, and how that can shake someone to their soul. There's something wonderful, I think, about potentially double and triple casting. So in our case, the actor who's playing the player king is also playing the ghost, and it allows him to be these kind of two father figures to Hamlet. He's also coming back in triple casting as one of the ambassadors. So we're actually going to have a man and a woman as Cornelius and Voltimand, doing the business of Claudius, and one is older, one is younger, one is a man, one is a woman. But I especially love that those two very different father figures, one that Hamlet is kind of intimidated by, and the other who is very comfortable with him. And Vince and I have talked about maybe a backstory where they went to Wittenberg, and he saw them play there, and went backstage, and so he's kind of a big theater geek himself. So he and that's why he even starts to quote from the play. And we've decided that he's pretty good. He's actually and that the players are respectful of his attempts to try to understand their livelihood. So that's something that we're really excited about. I want to take a moment to share, if this technology stays with me here, the images we've had from our thoughts on the early design process. So I'm going to share my, oh yes, we have something here from Erica. Brendon, if your Hamlet is set in the late 19th century Denmark, what book is Ophelia reading? One of Andersen's tragic fairy tales. He died in 1875. Oh, I love that. Thank you, Erica. We haven't decided yet, but now that's gone to the top of the list. It's really exciting, the idea of those gifts and those remembrances. We are exploring the idea of a brief prologue in the beginning of the play, with seeing Hamlet and Ophelia out in the snow, and potentially him giving her a gift then, which will then come back, and he'll reject that when she tries to give it back to him. Oh, I love this. Hamlet's reading Ibsen. That makes total sense, right? Something nice and dark for our melancholy day, and that's really appropriate. And you'll actually see some images here that remind me a lot of Ibsen. So I'm going to try this, see if we can see this. So we have some. I'm going to bring up some images here that were sort of our early inspirations. Hopefully, people can see them. This beautiful image here. And I mean, just that snowy landscape was something I felt was really evocative. These idea of some very, it's kind of a small image, but I'm gonna try to make this as, if we can, there we go, kind of big, sloping, tall images, almost kind of looming over us, that the set designer was playing with. We have some inspiration. This is actually Fredericksburg Castle, which we loved, and found that the scale and the elegance of that was pretty stunning. Again, we're not trying to replicate that or say this is exactly that, but this was evocative. These were all things we were collecting at the end of last year. We were starting to put together some, here's some other images of, speaking of young man reading a book, there's the stillness of that. I really loved the sort of kind of almost sepia tone, this kind of beautiful stillness with this, an image like that. We've also got that already. Oh yes, we got the interior here. So again, this sort of looking through doorways and windows and people just in shadow is something that was very exciting for our lighting designer, and she's going to explore that, people in half light, half images. And we started to play with the possibility of some, costumes as well. Some images here. We had an inspiration for Claudius here, right? Kind of the big hat and the plumed and the medals. Another idea, sort of mixing and matching elements. And I don't know if Christina is in the chat. If she is, she's welcome to jump in and share any thoughts. Here's what Christina created as sort of renderings and mood board, which she did beautifully for each character. So this gives us a sense of patterns, of color, images, which we're really excited by, though it gives us a little bit of her evolution. There's more to come, but I love that detail is so beautiful, and leaning into that elegance. This is where we're exploring for laertes, these sort of beautiful kind of almost culottes, these pants that almost look like a dress but they're actually pants. This image here is so exciting to me, that playing with gender and we're definitely exploring in rehearsal how Polonius has very mixed feelings about this, what his daughter is doing costume wise, but this definitely, we were leaning into like Laertes needs to go and find herself, but then that also leads to her guilt when she decides to leave Ophelia behind, so that when she comes back bent on revenge, some of that is her rage is directed at herself too, for leaving her younger sister behind. Have some, oh yes, the players here are really fun. Going to expand this for a moment here. So we've got some images here that are actually sort of more folk, a little bit from Lapland, from some different cultures that we're pulling from, but this will all eventually be a lot more distressed. This is them like as if they've never looked this good, but a lot dirtier version of this. But again, it'll just be sort of pieces and small props to represent king, queen, etc. And let's see what else. Oh, so on the set side, this is giving you some no one has really seen these except for us, so this is kind of exciting. This is an image of still in process, but there's us in rehearsal with that beautiful back wall and floor that Jim Kronzer is in the midst of creating. Eventually, upstage left here is where there's going to be a mirror image of this area. So there's going to be another staircase, another landing, and another staircase up here. So we've got a lot of different levels to play with, big double doors, lots of places for people to hide. They can come in through here, through up left, up center, also off this way, and also down left and down right into the audience. So the scale is something that I'm like I said, I'm really excited by. I think it gives a lot of play with power dynamics. And as you can see there, that sort of Jim is playing with in the floor there, some evoking ice cracking, things not holding together, things are a little bit falling apart. And it also just looks really, really cool. I think I've got just another close up on another angle on the floor here from above. It also allows us, everyone should be, to be aware of this. Lighting designers love dark floors because then a light floor bounces light everywhere, but a darker floor like this allows a lighting designer to carve up the space. They can carve it in half, we can carve it in quarters to some degree, and allowing us to play like a hallway. So you don't have to light the whole space. So our lighting designer was especially thrilled by that. And I think this is just one more from audience's point of view. And there's Ron and Vince being all Polonius and Hamlet like, and our wonderful stage managers there in front. Questions, comments, thoughts so far? Oh, this is interesting. Will you turn up the AC or open the windows if winter to create the cold atmosphere? Possibly, I hadn't thought of that. It's sort of like the old movie theaters of smell-o-vision, right? Like how environmental do we want to get with our environment? I think it's always something that's really exciting to explore with designers of like, how do we evoke that? And sometimes you're up against this challenge of, if you're doing something in the spring or early fall or summer when the audience comes in from somewhere really hot and they're trying to imagine in cold Norway or Denmark, and then and sometimes we have to do the opposite. I'm always in favor of being a little less than I don't want it to be too warm, because I'm sure some of you experience this, myself included. If it's nice and warm and cozy, I don't mind taking a little nap. So we do like to try to, that's a little theater theater pro tip there. If you find it slightly chilly, that might be a bit on purpose. Not that we're trying to freeze you out, but people tend to stay a little more awake. Not that you'll need that incentive with our production, but Raina, I believe maybe that's how you're saying your name. Beautiful set, thank you, Isaac. I'm currently watching the Royal Shakespeare production, Hamlet's played by a woman and Ophelia by a man. Casinos do the same thing. That's true, keeping people awake, and really, it's fascinating to see how we play with the environment. And I think just going back to gender as well for a moment, something that's been really exciting for me, and I believe for the cast, is that, and we're still right in the thick of this, but to sit around a table on a Shakespeare play, in my experience, you're typically surrounded by more men than women as co-collaborators. And we have men on the design team, but we have a lot of women on the design team as well. And I'm just really also excited by the number of women around the table in the cast who are creating women, who are creating men. There's a lot of different experiences that we're doing. And we're not coming in with a preconceived notion that because Horatio is being played by a woman, then the person will act a certain way. I'm really encouraged. These are actors who bring a lot of themselves to the table and are forging their own relationships with each other. We also had to figure out if Rosencrantz and Guildenstern know Hamlet from when he was younger, and Horatio knows Hamlet, why do they know each other? Have they crossed paths, right? And those are things you have to work out as a group. At the moment, what we've decided is that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern knew him from when he was much younger, and Horatio knows him only from his college days. So when they're together on stage, that's a very different composite that Hamlet gets to interact with these people in very different ways. So that's kind of exciting for the actors too. So those are some ideas so far. Wanted to touch on a few other things. So something you might all find interesting or of note is the ghost. So this discussion of how we'd evoke the ghost has been really fascinating. I posed it to the group a couple of months ago. I thought, there's a number of ways to approach how we evoke the supernatural. I did not have a set idea in my head, but I knew that it was important for us collectively to talk about that and not just have it be the costume designer or the lighting designer, which I've seen in the past. And so we had big group meetings about how do we evoke the supernatural. And as we discussed it together, people started to come up with the idea from the text. He talks about being in this liminal state, almost a purgatory, and the torture he's going through because he was killed before he could do penance for his sins. So he's stuck in that place. And we thought, well, what if since he's between worlds, is there some value in considering that he's beginning to potentially evaporate, or half of him is here, half of him is somewhere else? And that led the costume designer to think about, is his costume slowly being whited out from the waist down? Is he starting to lose focus? Someone brought up those photographs in Back to the Future, right? Where they start to fade away. Someone else was talking about the upside down in Stranger Things. And we thought that there's something that's very intense about his appearances early on. So we're creating these kind of shafts of light that the other characters can't get quite near, but he's sort of being whited out. And then once he talks to Hamlet alone, he's making a gesture and the entire dark night will be transformed into this bright, over-blinding light to Hamlet that is sort of slipped into this other parallel universe. So that way they can sort of step out of time for a moment and they can have this long discussion, because we were thinking, I'm sure you probably thought about this maybe when you're reading the play, Horatio and Marcellus go chasing after Hamlet and the ghost. And there are only a few lines right behind them when they go off stage. And we thought, how is Hamlet able to talk to the ghost for this long? And why hasn't Horatio and Marcellus shown up, right? They should be there by now. So we talked about this as a group and we thought, well, if they step into a sort of a wormhole, they pull a Doctor Who or something, right? And they just sort of allow themselves to be in a place that is the ghost's world, which is bright white light, or like Janet's world Janet's Void for those who watch The Good Place. We pull in references from all over, as you can tell. We thought this would be a way for the ghost to bring Hamlet into his world, to convey his powerful message and sort of shock him into this mission. And then when the ghost leaves, we're going to restore back to the nighttime cold of Denmark, and then Horatio and Marcellus come in. Because so basically, in their world, only 10 seconds have elapsed, but in Hamlet's world, it's been 10 minutes. So it's playing with ideas like that. Questions, comments so far on this? I'm curious if we have anyone from the team or from the company here. Gerard, is it just you and I? I'm just curious if there's anyone else from CSC on the line.
Hey, it's Ron. I'm in
Ron.
here. Yeah, I'm here on this.
So Ron, I just love to ask you. I mean, oh, and Christina here as well. So from what we've been discussing so far, and in your process and what you and I have talked about, anything you'd like to share with the group about this approach? I mean, you and I talked even before rehearsals began a bit on the phone. Anything you want to share at the moment on Polonius's evolution so far?
Yeah, no, I think I hope I'm unmuted.
Yes.
I think one of the things that I'm excited about, and I think several people that might be here in the class, as a member of the resident acting company, I was excited about working with Brendon because it's your first show at CSC, but I've never worked on Hamlet before. And when they talked to me last year about the season, they said, here's what it's going to look like. I had looked at it and went, okay, well, if I'm going to be doing, my hope is I would be doing Macbeth in the fall. And then I was looking at the spring and I was like, will I be able to do Measure for Measure and Hamlet? And so that was what I wanted. And so when I auditioned for Measure for Measure and played the Duke, I was like, okay, this is now going to influence what happens with my Polonius. And so it was great to be able to sit down and go, I just played the Duke as sort of a man-child in, abdicating his responsibility and then playing, this friar and then falling in love. And I said, I feel like I'd want something more substantial. And you were right on that line with like, no, what if he really is, the mastermind behind all of this? What if he's the consigliere and he's doing it? And I thought, oh, that's great. And I thought, ooh, that could be just so ruthless. and then you turn it by saying, now you have to deal with your daughter as Laertes. And so that then putting that in the realm of, okay, this is private. This is between, this is between dad and his eldest, who he has incredible hopes for. At the same time, he really wanted a son. And then what happens in that moment of being vulnerable and seeing actually their mother in their eyes. And so that to me was like, wow, you really have given me an interesting sort of set of complications and particularities that I get to sort of slalom, if you will, using a skiing metaphor since it'll be cold. And then just so you know, on top of all of that, to everybody that's here, so I will say that really enthused me about playing Polonius. So there's that, number one. And then number two, just so you know, Brendon then said, oh yeah, would you like to play the Gravedigger?
Oh, yes.
And I almost like my jaw hit the floor because I thought, no, there's no way. And then I went, oh man. So yeah, so that's sort of being able to do that in the same play to me was a little bit like, oh, how great. So yeah, I guess that I'll just put that out there.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. That, I mean, two things on that. One of the things that Ron's already exploring that we're trying to do a lot through the play is the public and the private. And that he mentioned that sense of when it's, I'm fascinated by when characters generally in Shakespeare are in control, then when are they not?
Right.
And then when are characters who are generally at loose ends, when do they have a moment of together? And I think this, what we're beginning to explore that you're touching on is that he is so in control in so many ways. But we're leaning into also the awkwardness of when you're trying to connect with Laertes or Ophelia, it's not easy. And and that this is a guy that knows how to actually kill a king, but doesn't know how to talk to his daughter. And I think that's something maybe we can relate to, whether we're Danish or not, or from any time period. It's fish out of water time for Polonius. And I was encouraging Ron and the actors playing Ophelia and Laertes to lean into they love him, but also the awkwardness, but also Laertes really wants to go, and that maybe that chafing of she knows that he wanted a boy is also leading her to go off to Paris. So we're not making it easy on any of them. And I think it's kind of great, especially I found when we worked on this, Ron, with your scene with Reynaldo, and then immediately Ophelia bursts in, and I purposely wanted Ophelia, I cut the script so that she would interrupt the scene, and that it catches both Reynaldo and Ron as Polonius off balance, and that there's this weird moment of when the personal and the political collide for him. And you know, what Ron's beginning to discover is like, as soon as Ophelia comes in, Reynaldo ceases to exist, right? She's wallpaper, forget, oh, you're gone, I don't care, just go. And you can see him being really brusque and saying, you've got your marching orders, now what fresh hell is this? And that messiness is exciting to me. To me, that's always important to me in Shakespeare, because I think there's a preconceived notion of, we have all the words, we have all the beautiful tones, we are unflappable, and it all feels a little preordained sometimes. And I keep wanting to, maybe to Ron's chagrin, keep wanting to throw spammers in the works to say, okay, how can we make this messier? And that's been an exciting thing with this group. And to speak to the grave digging, so yeah, I can't believe I wasn't on my list, but yeah, so the thought about that was, obviously we were looking at months ago doubling and tripling casting, and one of the things that's often done with the gravedigger is to have the actor who plays the ghost and maybe the player king also maybe come back as the gravedigger, because you're also trying to figure out like who's around at that point, right, in Act 5 and such. But what I started to think was, when I looked at that scene between the gravedigger and the assistant, or the second gravedigger, I saw camaraderie, I saw love between those two, I saw jokes and riddles, and I started thinking like, well, who's sitting around their dressing room? we've got Polonius, we've got Ophelia, and the potential to have them come back as the gravediggers. So we're approaching the gravediggers as those are going to be played by the actors playing Polonius and Ophelia. Both of them are dead by that point. Now they are reincarnated, if you will, and now they're actually father-daughter gravedigging teams. And they are actually a really wonderful family. I would pose to the group, they may be the least toxic family in the play. So that's a public service announcement. Go into, think about other professions. This idea of them being able to banter with each other, and even though we haven't yet gotten to the staging of it, even around the table, it was really incredible, not only to watch them interact in a new way as actors, but for the rest of the cast to watch this, which I think was really delightful. And when things get so dark and tumultuous late in the play, I think it's going to be really wonderful to watch these two bring a different energy to this, where I thought it was important to show that in this case, this family, even for a half moment, could use wordplay and language to show affection for each other. So I was glad when, it definitely blew Ron's mind, and Amber's, who plays Ophelia. But she told me she was excited because she's like, I'm so glad I'll be able to come back and have a little fun after I've gone crazy. And also I can look a mess. So as Ophelia, she'll get to look beautiful, then she's gonna look, distraught, and then she'll get to come back and look like she's out of Les Mis or something. Erica says, Brendon, if there's time, would you talk more about your theme of surveillance and how you bring that out? And is this linked at all to the ways you are further mixing up gender? For example, if Horatio is Hamlet's female longtime best friend, is she spying a bit on Hamlet's romance with Ophelia? That's actually, I hadn't thought of that, but there are levels of the surveillance that are going to be something for us to mine, because as you mentioned, Hamlet spends a lot of time with Horatio. And as you all know from studying the text, he says to Horatio, I trust you deeply. no one's closer to my soul than you, and you know, too much of this, he even gets a little embarrassed by it. And I think that's fascinating, that what is his relationship with Ophelia versus relationship with Horatio? If you play it as two men, as someone mentioned earlier in the notes, you can explore the potentially a queer angle to it. In our case, that's going to be exciting for us to explore as well. But I'm just in love with Shakespeare, who ends up being on stage a lot, right? Hamlet spends a lot of time with Horatio. He spends a certain amount of time with Ophelia. When does Hamlet do surveillance? When does Horatio get enlisted to do that? And what does Horatio see? And what does she think about what she's seeing? And also, one thing that the woman playing Horatio brought up so far is, when does she push back against Hamlet? I think there's opportunities there that we want to explore, that Horatio is not just a rubber stamp for Hamlet's actions or ideas, and that she's already finding exciting ways to not just be a whetstone for his ideas, but actually somebody who can register even non-verbally, I'm not sure that's a good idea, or you treated that person really harshly. You know, when he comes back and says, oh, guess what happened? I sent Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to their deaths. And she says, so Rosencrantz and Guildenstern go to it. And the way that the actress is exploring that right now is with a lot of ambivalence and some judgment on Hamlet. And it forces Vince as Hamlet to kind of justify. And he says, well, they went, you know, who cares? They made love to their employment. You know, they're not on my conscience. And I'm excited to see where that goes. So some of that involves surveillance, like you said, Erica, and some of it's going to be in how she's going to approach Horatio as somebody who is almost pure empathy, someone who's actually trying to understand multiple points of view here. I wanted to see if Christina, you had your hand up earlier. Are you free to? I had a question for you if you're available.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, if you're comfortable sharing, would you mind talking a little bit about when you and I started talking about gender, for example, and approaching these characters in these ways? Well, first of all, have you designed Hamlet before?
Yes. For CSC, we did do Hamlet back in 2010. So I did that version. And then, funny enough, my final project for my custom design 2 class in college was Hamlet set at the turn of the 20th century. So it was kind of exciting to revisit that my old design thoughts from quite a while ago.
Yeah. Oh, I just saw a cameo by your dog, I think. That was,
oh, yeah. Yes.
So when we come back to an era that you were a little familiar with already. What about in terms of when we started approaching the gender of some of these characters? Had you done that before in previous iterations?
No, not in this, not in Hamlet previously. Yeah, it was interesting because I think, as we talked, we weren't really playing, the females, none of them were really playing them as males. So like for instance, I mean, you guys saw what, I had designed for Laertes, kind of that gentleman Jack was sort of the influence going, for that character. But Horatio, yes, it's going to be female, but she is going to be wearing a male cut suit, like a sack suit. But it's not, we're not giving her, a wig to make it look like she has short hair. It's going to be, she is going to be female, just wearing a man's suit. So yeah, I feel like we're doing some different things in this version. A lot of times when we do alternate casting for gender, typically, it's like, my first question is always, okay, is this female actor playing female? Is it female playing male? How are we going? So it was a longer discussion on this one because it was so many female actors, cast in sort of, the traditionally male parts. But and even like, with Horatio with her hair, it's going to be up and back, but it's not trying to make her a man, not trying to hide that that's a female. So I figure kind of costuming that way, the actor has a little more leeway in how they want to interpret it. And it's always, I was so excited about, we'd been working so long on the preparation for the show, and then to have to kind of put everything on pause after a week of rehearsal, it was really, really disheartening. So we'll get back to it, and because I had just started building the costumes, and getting really excited, but we'll get there.
Yeah. I'm also, I think what was exciting about collaborating with you early on, Christina, was the way that we were just talking generally about the characters and what they wanted, how they presented themselves to the world. We'd also talk about gender, but that was only one aspect of it. And so you and I were talking about how Claudius wanted to maybe show off. So when Christina was sharing some of her early ideas with me about maybe him in this big uniform, I thought at first, well, okay, but he's not really a soldier the way his brother is. And one thing you shared, Christina, was, no, but this is him sort of being a toy soldier, right? This idea of trying to show off. It also allows us to have him start to unravel over the course of the play. So he's at his most put together in the beginning, but there's an arc to that.
Yeah, as I said, his uniform is more of like the ceremonial uniform, the type of uniform they would have portraits painted of them, wearing that, not so much like, a practical, I'm actually, I would go to war wearing this. Very, very much decorative and ceremonial in how he would look.
Yeah, that's great. There's, something, I don't know if you all in the class have talked much about this or have had much experience, past experience with this but I think it would be useful potentially to take a second to talk about the early stages of rehearsal that I think some people, I'm the first person in my family to go into the theater. So I had a lot of on-ramping of my family and friends to do with helping understand some of the process. But the idea of table work, is that something that is familiar to people or not? If it is, can anyone, share what that is, what that means when you hear that term, when actors are doing table work, or a director and actors? Any thoughts on that? Yes?
Yes?
Yes, you're on.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
I just think table work is really important, and not like just one go through. You've got to sit and talk about, what does this mean when you're saying it? What does that mean in context of the greater play? Where are we going? What are we doing in this scene? And you've got to have an understanding beyond. Once you stand up and start blocking, you've got to understand what the context of what everybody's talking about. Or else does that make sense why anybody's standing here or there, unless you know what everybody's talking about and saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And and that sense of, like, you're talking about intention, right? Like, what you're not just saying the line, but why are you saying it? What do you want to get from somebody by saying it? Different directors do table work at different times. So in my experience, on the first day of rehearsal, you often have what I call show and tell, right? That the designers the work they've done up to that point, share with the actors and the rest of the team what they've worked on. So that's when Christina walked everyone through her renderings with every character. Jim Kronzer shared with us his renderings for the set. So it gives the actors a sense like this is still in process, but it allows them to see where we've come so far and how we're building the physical world. Many productions then, some directors like to do a read-through right off the bat. Some never do a read-through of the play. Some do a table work and break things down and then do a read-through. Some people like to get right on their feet, and then they do table work a few days in. I worked in Texas with in repertory with another production of Henry V, and I was doing Two Gentlemen of Verona, and I was doing table work for 4 or 5 days, and those 5 days, he staged all of Henry V on their feet. And he didn't do table work. And I would go out for drinks with him and said, am I way behind? Because you staged this entire play. And he said, no. Brendon, you're doing a Chekhov play. I'm doing an action film. He said, it all is different. So as directors, and I know sometimes audiences realize it and sometimes not, but there's a lot of ways to skin the cat. For him, and I found this sometimes, especially for the history plays and such, there's a lot of battles, right? There's a lot of fights, and it's gearing up for a fight, coming off of a fight. So often it's helpful as a director and your cast to get in that fight choreography early. Sometimes if you're doing a Shakespeare comedy, there's dances. Sometimes in As You Like It, there's dances and fights. So if you front load that, instead of maybe taking time initially to do table work, you might want to pencil sketch in the whole thing first, then circle back and now say, now that we know the skeleton, and we know where the fights are, and we know that, now let's think more about our text. And again, those are just different perspectives as director. I typically now don't tend to do a read through at the top because I like to get into the table work, because I find that for me, sometimes read throughs put actors on the spot. Some actors where they feel like they have to now deliver a performance. Some actors are like, I'm not gonna perform at all. I'm just gonna say it like a robot, and someone else will do something else. I don't find that particularly useful. I prefer to jump in and start from the first line, and I believe everyone can offer a thought. So I think there is a tendency in American theater sometimes for people to like stay in your lane, right? Hamlet can only talk about Hamlet, Ophelia talks about Ophelia, Ron can't talk about anything but Polonius and Gravedigger. And I really try to push back at that. With how I set up the room, because I feel like it's exciting for the whole group to talk about every scene. And sometimes someone who has 2 lines in the scene can offer a perspective that really blows people away. But it takes time. So we spend 4+ days going line by line through the cut. That's the other thing too. Every director, sometimes director and a dramaturg, work together on making a cut. I spent approximately upwards of 4 months on my cut. I would say close to 5 months. And I had to decide every line you cut or keep in is a choice. And every character you keep in or cut. Some productions of Hamlet cut Fortinbras. Some cut Reynaldo. I mean, some even cut the Gravediggers. That helps determine what kind of production you're doing. And also how long it is. So that's also a reason to, as you break down the play early on, it gives me a chance to hear the cut and to hear whether I want to either do a little more cutting or if I want to add something in because I cut too much, right? And now it doesn't make sense. That line to this line, there's a gap there. So we have to add more connective tissue. It's an organic thing, but I find table work really exciting because it allows people to not be prescriptive, but actually to say, so what is happening here? And what are we all going for? And we like to talk about objectives. What does the character want here? What does the character, do they get it? What's their obstacle? And for me, that goes beyond what period, right? What costume, any of that, that doesn't, to me, that doesn't matter. It's still, everyone on stage is out there to get something. That keeps plays active, and they're called actors, right? So they're acting on their environment and they want to get something. So the prettiest speech in the world in Shakespeare is still about how do I get what I need? And if it's no one on stage, it's you and the audience, I believe. I'm trying to wrestle this with you as my scene partner. And what it does was, and you touched on this just now, once we do that table work after 4+ days, we get on our feet and the staging tends to go very swiftly because people have an idea of what they want from each other. They've already started to also become familiar with each other. They start developing a shorthand. They've laughed a little bit. We've shared candy, maybe too much candy that was brought in by the director to charm his cast, right? I'm not naming names, but that allows people to start to kind of get in there and get in the ring. And that was exciting.
It seems to me that you also need to particularly when you're doing a play that was like written in one century about another century with references from another century, and you're doing it now in the 21st and in about the 20th, that you now have to start going through lines and go, are we referencing this in the 1500, and 1400, in the 21st century? How are we making the audience understand this part? How do they bite into it?
Absolutely. No, you hit it on the head. We've got to have a, if they're making a reference to something, was that an Earl that Shakespeare was referencing? Well, that's not going to work for the audience, right? They're not sitting there with their dramaturgy packet open, hopefully. They're watching a play with real bodies in real time, three-dimensionally, live their life. And I think this idea of we need to figure out a modern translation. I don't mean we translate the line. I mean, I ask the actor, okay, in your words, what did you just say? I'm a big fan, everyone, in what is the 2020 version of what you said. And I encourage the actors to sort of give me the R-rated, most extreme version of that. So when you're giving a big O for a muse of fire, or what an ass am I, or this dull and muddy-mettled rascal, we don't use those terms. But if they know what they mean in their mind for 2020 and it's extreme, then they can say it in a way and color it that the audience will go, oh, he's pissed, or she's horny, or there's like, we will get it. What it can't be is neutral. It's got to be painted with intention, and it's a way to, like you said, straddle the then and the now. Sometimes a term will be so obscure, and an actor in rehearsal has been trying to make it sound like a sex joke, of which there are thousands in Shakespeare, which is awesome. But it's just not coming across. And and then do we help with a gesture, or do we potentially, make the choice to cut it? I've had previews where we believe this thing will kill and it's hilarious in rehearsal, and it lands like a lead balloon over and over with an audience. And we go, okay, we gave it our best shot, our best Shakespeare try, but I try to be really judicious about that. In general, I really believe in the actors, if they know what they're saying, because the audience is only going to get 80%, right? Let's be honest, folks. Even if you study this play, it's a foreign language. There's something lost in translation. But if the actor only knows 50, 60, 70%, you're going to get 30%, right? We've all been there. I've seen those shows where if the actor is bland or vague in what they're saying, if it feels like they're rushing through something, or they're saying it with this weird Shakespeare, John Gielgud voice, then you're going to check out because you can't follow it. But that's not on you. That's on them. That's on me and us. We need to know it 1000% exactly why we're saying that metaphor, that image, and make it clear to you so you can get as much as you can out of it. So thank you for that. We have a question from Raina May about, can you share what you are cutting? I know it's a long play, but it all seems important. Yes. Believe me, this is why it took so many months, because so many sleepless nights when I thought I'd wake up and see the ghost of Shakespeare and not Hamlet's father over my bed saying, how dare you cut that line? And this is really what directors talk about who do Shakespeare. It is like you really have, it's very hard because you have to be rigorous. And at a certain point, what helps is those big ideas I discussed at the beginning of our class. If I think about surveillance, if I'm thinking about gender relationships, if I'm thinking about corruption and such, then that starts to help inform my cut, right? So if I'm thinking about corruption and surveillance, then I felt like I needed to keep Reynaldo's scene. Now, I made internal cuts within that scene with Reynaldo, but I think that, for another production that's not caring about those big ideas, that's not part of the spine of their production, then I think it totally makes sense for them to cut Reynaldo, right? For those who want to attack Hamlet as a family drama, then they can cut Voltimand, Cornelius, Fortinbras entirely out and focus on that. We decided I like the idea of playing with generations. So to have a young Fortinbras and a young Hamlet, one who's all action and one who talks a hell of a lot about action, I thought it was important to keep Fortinbras in play. But And you also have actors understandably read the cut and go, this is great. Can we keep this line in? And so there is a pitching that goes on in the first couple of weeks of I was so, Brendon, this line, it's amazing. And they're right. So my policy now is I'm open to accepting that new line if you can help me find one to cut. So think of it like carbon neutral, right? That this is like, because otherwise we start getting that bloat, and then it's like, well, then why cut, right? We all love it all, but I think that it really is bound to the themes, the big ideas, and how you want to attack the play. I also have a lot of cutoffs. I have a lot of shared lines in my cut because I want this sense of the whole, like I said, the whole play running downhill, people really grabbing at straws. There's a sense of freneticism, of kineticism, and people being very visceral with each other. So I tried to reflect that. If you looked at a copy of my cut, you'd see a lot of short lines, a lot of dashes. So if I made a cut, often it's internal. One of the biggest cuts and changes I made, I hope you're all sitting down for this, is I moved To Be or Not to Be. I actually moved it to Act 4, and I replaced Hamlet's speech when he's talking about Fortinbras with To Be or Not to Be. And here's why we decided to do that. I felt the more I looked at the play, and I studied other directors' productions for many months, and I studied, there are whole texts out there just on the Hamlet soliloquies, where they happen, why they happen, what goes on. A couple of reasons. One, I felt that the Hamlet speech about Fortinbras, when I was looking for cuts, to me, did not propel the play forward that much at that point in Act 4. He also was saying things like in Act 4, why don't I kill my uncle when I have the cause and the means to do it? Well, he actually at that moment doesn't have the means to do it. He's almost under arrest, basically escorted to England, and he probably suspects he's going to die there. So what I felt that there was some tension there between what he's saying and what's actually happening to him in Act 4. But I also felt that To Be or Not to Be, we're treating that as kind of his nadir, his lowest point, when he has failed to kill Claudius. He has the blood of Polonius on his hands. He's now being escorted across the barren winter wasteland of Denmark, going off to England, thinking this might be a one-way trip, maybe never seeing his mother again. And then he's just had this conversation, if you remember, with the sergeant who works for Fortinbras. And if you recall, Hamlet says, oh, you're going off to fight for this land. It must be really important. And the sergeant is like, no, it's bullshit. Like thousands of people are going to die for nothing, and for a straw. And Hamlet looks at that and says, his response is, why live? What's the point of all of this? What's the point of that? What's the point of me? This doesn't make any, and none of it makes any sense. And he uses the To Be or Not to Be in that context to navigate his feelings and how alone he is. And earlier, how that has helped us is that he's not going from suicidal To Be or Not to Be, potentially going right into seeing Ophelia and saying, nymph, in thy orisons be all my sins remembered. He actually is coming into that scene with Ophelia, thinking about what he's going to do with Claudius, but it's actually helping him navigate into that scene of love and past mistakes, and how to navigate Ophelia in a way that is frankly less awkward than I've seen in many productions. And I've actually talked to a number of Hamlets and Ophelias who have worked on past productions. And I have to share that to a person, they all said the hardest, the most challenging pivot was to go from To Be or Not to Be, and oh my God, look, it's my lover. So I think that, again, there's always a cost benefit, but I'm really excited by what it brings us in terms of Hamlet entering that scene with Ophelia, and what it's going to do in that Act 4 space of Hamlet questioning everything. And then we're going to use the very end of his speech about Fortinbras to start to unpack, what do I do now? And then he's interrupted by Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. and he's let out off stage. So as he goes off in his direst moment, the next thing we see is Ophelia at her most low moment. And there's a beautiful synchronicity there that I think is going to be potentially really powerful. And then when he comes back, it's like another Hamlet. It's a new Hamlet who has sprung back from this lowest ebb, who has boarded the pirates, who has taken advantage of the situation, and who's sort of on this new spirit of what's going to happen is going to happen. But he has rebounded from that place. So a couple of hands. Emily Hansen?
So it's interesting because one of the things in different productions I've always seen with the to be or not to be a speech is how much of this is Hamlet performing for what he may or may not know is Polonius and Claudius hiding behind him. And you've kind of taken a circle around that, and it's very much an actual, like, that, yes, this is what I'm thinking, rather than I'm performing this for, and this sense of depression for other people.
Absolutely, and I love that comment that we decided after a lot of discussion around the table was that he's going to come into that earnestly. Just look, when he says to her, "Look, there's Ophelia, in thy eyes, please remember all my sins," and he's in a place of openness and vulnerability, and then somewhere over the course of the scene, he's going to realize they're listening. So instead of him knowing from the beginning, what we're exploring with Amber as Ophelia is that perhaps she's going to tip him off to that. And her trying to be an ally, potentially, to him, even in the midst of them both feeling manipulated. So then he has to now deal with that knowledge right in the middle of the scene with her. And so then, because one thing that I'm very passionate about and feel very strongly about is that I've seen too many productions where that Hamlet Ophelia scene becomes very violent to her and very misogynistic. And one thing you'll notice in my cut is I've actually cut some of his lines, both pertaining to his mother and Ophelia, which is a level of misogyny that I don't need to explore in 2020. Not saying that he isn't rude to them at times, but the way Vince and Amber and I are beginning to approach that scene is that he is angry with her, around her, near her. She is kind of the collateral damage and can be traumatized by that, but it's not like this is all your fault. And because I'm trying to do my own part as a director to try to be mindful about depicting violence against women. And I think that Hamlet can be in dire straits, and she can be as well, without it becoming a one-way street of attack on her. Because he's smart enough to know it's not her, it's bigger than her. But she's there in the bomb blast when he finds out that he's being manipulated. So Vince is exploring some wonderful possibilities of right now in rehearsal of maybe he's gonna go after Claudius. Maybe he's gonna charge up there and open those doors, right? It's something that I love, like an actor like Vince and Ron and this great cast, where they're ready to just try every extreme choice. But so we are taking away that level of performance, like you said. But I think what we're gaining is some real beauty between those two who are caught up in something bigger than them.
I like that.
Great, thank you. Zoe, you said, what if Hamlet is saying, remember me in your prayers when I'm gone, to Ophelia, because he has chosen not to be, as it were? Oh, yeah, that's really beautiful, Zoe. I think that makes a lot of sense, that if you keep that to be or not to be where it is, then him coming off of that, there could be a bridge that he builds from that. The other thing, if you keep that speech in that place, every production has to decide, Ophelia's already on stage, supposedly. So does she hear that? I've seen productions where she sort of is in shadow, and this is all very interior and in his mind, and the audience knows that she can't hear it. She eavesdrops in some productions. So it allows a lot of those things to happen. But in this scenario, I think by taking that away, we're actually putting Ophelia kind of front and center for a lot of this, because if you all look back at your text when you have a chance at that scene is a long scene. And it starts very early with a lot of other things going on, a lot of other business for Claudius and Gertrude and Polonius. And Polonius brings in his daughter to read, the love letter and such. But we have Ophelia on stage for a while, as if she's basically Exhibit A. So it really puts her in the hot seat and in a very awkward position where these older people in power are basically just using her and talking about her right there. And that's something that I feel very strongly about, is this difference between the generations too, that the sins of the father going on to the son, and how these young people really get decimated by these choices done by people who are there, who should know better, and they have to pick up the pieces or be consumed by it. Oh yes, I've got someone called Owner's iPad, and then Martin.
Ignore the owner's iPad. I don't know how that went up.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Sorry.
That's fine. I can lower your hand. Martin?
I've got to say that, like, putting to be or not to be right after, like, making it sort of like a meditation on what's life worth after, like, looking at how feudal war is, makes a lot of sense, and it matches, like, our modern sensibilities a lot more than Hamlet looking at that and being like, well, if they can die for no reason, why can't I die for, it's a bit more satisfying. But and it makes it like, to be or not to be, it makes it an actual urgent question that we want to know the answer to right before changing acts. Like, oh crap, like, has he given up?
The
only issue is it puts the answer to that question off stage, right? I mean, when him deciding to be would be like turning the tables on the pirates and coming back. So it kind of puts like a lot of weight on how well the actors can just talk about it in Act 5. So is there any way that Act 5 is staged? Is there any changes to the way Act 5 staged to sort of like compensate for like all the new?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And you're right that there's a lot in Shakespeare that happens off stage already, and in this case, you're right, that pivot happens off stage. I think so far, again, to be continued, right? There's orange cones around this whole construction site, but at the moment, we're not thinking necessarily that we're going to kind of flesh out the offstage events so much as we will do is like Laertes, I mean not Laertes, Horatio talks in the letter from Hamlet about what's going to happen, and one thing I'm exploring potentially is some of that letter might be shared between Hamlet and Horatio. So we actually might get to see Hamlet in a spot or something dovetailing with the letter with Horatio. So we kind of clock him talking about this in the moment, right? And then we also see Horatio with her processing this, and that there could be two different tones, if that makes sense, Martin. That sense of like, you know how that is, right? Someone's writing an email in a certain tone and you receive it like, what? WTF, right? And he's going, this is amazing, right? But she might be receiving it like, what did you do? That's awful, right? So that it gives us a chance to visually set eyes on him, have a moment to check in, and because I think exactly for what the reasons you're saying, and I think that going back to, like you said, it puts the urgency and the question really front and center, and that's something we're trying to do. Is that he's been triggered by the final straw is. Also, he has blood in his hands. I mean, that's the other thing I would say, to add to what you're saying, Martin, is that like, when he says to be or not to be earlier, it's just a different, perspective. But by us doing it now, where we're doing it, this is somebody who already has killed and then will kill again with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. That's a different person than talking about suicide and the idea of death a little more abstractly. he has now run Polonius through. He is looking at a dead body that he caused.
The tone difference is really cool. Real quick, I should say, for owner's iPad, you can right click on yourself and rename yourself. To show, I don't know, whatever name you want. The tone is really cool, because when I first read the scene in Act 5 between Hamlet and Horatio has that line, well, what a king is this, right? I misread it, and I thought that Horatio was saying, this is right after Hamlet saying, well, I don't care about Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. They had it coming. I thought Horatio was saying, well, what a king you're going to be once this works out. And I know that's not the way it was intended to be read, but it's always stuck with me that Horatio is willing to call Hamlet out on certain things.
But I would just say, I know we're almost at time, but I think you bring up a great point, Martin, that like there isn't a lock on how we do it. That to me is why we can keep going back to the well of Shakespeare. To me, I'm excited to always see productions of Shakespeare, because if they have thought through their ideas, their choices, their cuts, and and all the way to, like, I think, Martin, that choice of how an actor might say that line, I'd never thought of that. I think that could be really cool. I don't think that's necessarily off limits. So I think we are our own limit makers for that. But I want to thank you all for such great questions and comments. It means a lot that you're also invested and thoughtful in your give and take. And I hope to see you all, back in the audience down the line. So I guess Ron or anyone else from CSC, Jared, is there anything in terms of wrapping up that you would like?
No, I don't think so. Thank you, Brendon, and thank you everyone else for joining us this evening. Just as a reminder, next week, Ron will be leading our session, and he'll be going through the language and style of text in the play, as well as some of the big speeches. If anyone that has not already volunteered to read a speech or be a reader thinks that they want to do that, feel free to email me this week so that I can add your name to the list. If not, then we may get some repeats of people that have already volunteered. So once again, thank you. And everyone have a good night, and I will see you next week. And thanks
everyone.
Again, Brendon.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Brendon.
That's great.
Are you done?